After I finished telling about society, I began a project with a very old friend of mine, Robert Faulkner. Rob is a sociologist, also a trumpet player, and he and I have been friends for many, many years. We've played together often, but we have never worked together as sociologists. He is an expert on music in Hollywood and wrote two wonderful books, one about the musicians who make the soundtracks for Hollywood films, and the other one about the composers who compose the music for Hollywood films. And he and I began to talk about our experiences playing music professionally. And he and I recognized that there's a wonderful question for social science in the everyday experience of musicians who play in bars or clubs or for dancing or for parties. And here's the question. Every night, all over the world, in many, many places, 3 or 4 or 5 musicians who have never met before and don't know each other, and certainly have never played together before, and who have no written music with them, get up on the bandstand and they begin to play. And they play together beautifully, no problem. And so the question for a social scientist is, how do they do that? Because it's not obvious. And in fact, the chief finding of our research is that they negotiate. They have to find what they know in common, what they can do together, and work out the procedure, work out what they're going to do as they do it. The negotiations take very little time. It can be just like that. Sometimes just a look. But there's all the mystery is in these few moments when they find what they're going to play. The book is finished. It will be published in July 2009 by the University of Chicago Press. So that's the latest thing. And we had such a good time working together. It's a very good partnership. So we decided to do another book, which we have just begun, and it's going to be called Squawk. I should add that one of the major ideas in organizing this work is the really marvelous addition to the theory of deviance that Gilberto Velho made a long time ago. I think it must be 30 years. He wrote 2 papers, which I had the honor to translate, about accusations. And he proposed that the theory of labeling was missing something by talking always about deviance, and that we should rather talk about accusations. Because if you talk about deviance, you run into a large number of theoretical problems, which I never thought were very serious problems, but many other people did, because they're problems of terminology, of how to say things, what name to give things. And if you talk about accusations, it simplifies everything, because there is no problem to know when somebody accuses somebody. You are a criminal. No argument about that. And Gilberto made that the core of the study of deviance. And I think it was a wonderful, brilliant move. And so we're going to build on that. Also, in the back of my mind, I have an idea for another book, which my wife is very anxious for me to write, about comparison. Because I have written now 3 books that deal with the problems of doing social science. The book about writing social science, the book called Os Segredos, Tricks of the Trade, and the book telling about society, all published by Czar. And I have an idea for a 4th. And this would be a book about comparison, because I have come to think that comparison is the main social science method. Of course, I don't have to tell that to anthropologists. They all know that. But a lot of sociologists don't. And I think over the years, I've written several things that use the method of comparison in interesting ways. And now I have to understand what I did when I wrote those papers, what my method really was.
You have such a nice titles for all your books. Do you have a title for this one too?
Yes, I do. In fact, the title is the reason that I really want to write the book. The title is, What About Mozart? What About Murder? And it's a comparison of problems that arise in the sociology of art, the sociology of deviance, and the sociology of science. I got interested in this question, it's another story, when I first published Outsiders many years ago. I was living in San Francisco, and I was asked to go across the bay to Berkeley, to the University of California, and talk about the new book. The director of the Center for the Study of Law and Society, a very distinguished and wonderful sociologist named Philip Selznick, I knew did not really agree with my ideas about deviance. He thought that some things really were deviant, not just labels. And so I gave my talk, and at the end of the talk, Selznick was standing in the back of the room, smoking a cigar, and he looked up and said, "Well, Howie," he said, "that's very interesting, but tell me, what about murder? Isn't that really deviant?" Well, I knew immediately that there was a kind of verbal trickery involved, and I explained it, but he wasn't satisfied. And the problem was that what he wanted was for sociology to say that something was evil, bad, wicked. Not just for him to say this as his personal opinion or even as the opinion of some group he belonged to, but that science said it was bad. And I thought that science simply can't say that. It can tell you how things work. You can decide what's good and what's bad. Some years later, I was teaching at Northwestern, and I had become interested in the sociology of art, and I had written this book called Art Worlds. And the dean of the college was a philosopher who specialized in aesthetics, so he was very interested. And he decided to have a series of lectures by senior faculty, and he asked me if I would give the first lecture and talk about my new book. Well, I suspected that he would feel I was too much of a relativist, but what can I do? I am. So I gave my talk, and I talked about how art is a social construct, etc., etc. And as soon as I finished, I could see the dean was like very unhappy. The first question, he has his hand up, and he said, and it was just like the first one, he said, "Howie, what about Mozart?" Well, now I understood the entire structure of the argument that he was, because what he meant was, after all, everybody knows that Mozart really was an artistic genius, and that what he made was art, and it's not just a matter of definition. So I said to him, and he said, "Well, don't you agree that Mozart is a genius?" And I said, "Of course I agree. But I also know that the tenor saxophone player, Lester Young, is a genius, and I don't think you agree with me, if you ever heard of him. And I don't have a way to prove to you that Lester Young is a genius, and that what he does is art, and you don't have a way to prove to me that Mozart is a genius, even though we both agree. That we both agree doesn't settle the question." Well, he was not happy. And then I saw now I have two cases. The same sort of question comes up when you discuss science, because people who really believe in science believe that it's a special kind of truth, and it's really true. That science solves all the problems of epistemology, just as aesthetics solves all the problems about art, and ethics solves all the problems about deviance. So people say to you, they don't quite say, "What about Mozart?" But they say, "You think science is just a social construct? How do you have the courage to fly in an airplane if you don't believe in science?" I mean, it's the same question, really. And Latour has a marvelous answer. He says to people, "I believe in science just as much as the scientists do, no more." Because, as his research showed over and over, scientists don't exactly believe in the truth of science, because they know that everything that people used to think was true turned out not to be true, and was replaced by another understanding which was more complete. Of course, they always think that the current version is correct, but they know, in their mind, they know that maybe not. And so Bruno says, "I believe just as much as they do, but they don't believe in it either." Most of the good things that ever happened in my life resulted from accidents, coincidence. Certainly nothing I did with real purpose or intention or with a plan. The way I arrived in Brazil was, I had a friend here named, I can't think of his name now, but he was an American psychologist, and he worked for the Ford Foundation in Rio de Janeiro. He was in charge of higher education. And he called me one day from Brazil, and he said, "You have to," this was in 1975, I think, maybe 76. And he said, "You have to come here, because there's this anthropologist who knows your work, and is very interested in it, and you could come down and teach with him for a few months. It would be nice." So I said to him, "Richie, I said, I don't even know where Brazil is exactly. All I know about Brazil is bossa nova and samba, because I play the piano. He said, no, you have to come down. I said, well, I can't come now, it's in the summertime. Summertime I always spend in San Francisco, where it's cold and wonderful. Finally, he persuaded me that I should come later on in the year, and that first he would send the Brazilian anthropologist to Chicago during the summer vacation, which of course was in January. So Gilberto Velho was then a young person, arrived in Chicago in January. It was snowing, it was freezing. Gilberto got off the airplane. He told me later he almost got right back on to go back. He said, what is a poor carioca like me doing in a place like this? But he was very brave, very courageous. He stayed for a month. And made friends with many people in the sociology department at Northwestern, because I think it's not a secret that what Gilberto does is certainly as much sociology as it is anthropology. And then he went back to Brazil, and then later on I went to Brazil and I taught at the Museu Nacional in the program for 2 months with Gilberto. I taught entirely in English, although in the year between I was nervous and I studied Portuguese. I went to the language laboratory at the university every morning for 1 hour, and so I acquired some rudiments of Brazilian Portuguese. I also read the books that he had sent me. There is a funny thing. Before we met, he had read my books. I had read the 2 books he sent. Very difficult because I didn't know Portuguese. But I got a dictionary and I looked every word up, and after a while I could read it. But I imagined that Gilberto Velho was like an important anthropologist, that he was an older person, with a long white beard, which is how he imagined me. And when he got off the plane and we saw each other, we started to laugh because it was so ridiculous. So I taught. I met a lot of people that first year. I can't remember all of them. People gave me a lot of things to read, and I read them. And of course, the more I read, the better I got at reading. And I even could speak a little bit. I also collected a big pile of music and records, no CDs, before CDs, LPs, and came back with all this stuff, and really knew more Brazilian music than 99% of American musicians as a result. And then we kept in touch. He invited me again for a big 3-day conference about mental health, which I was a minor figure in this. The big names were Irving Goffman, although I was the person who was supposed to persuade Goffman to come to Brazil, and Thomas Zaz, the well-known theorist about mental illness, and the writer of books about sex, Cher Haidt, was also there. It was a very funny occasion. And so that was, I stayed for about 2 weeks. And then I came back in 1990 and taught again as a Fulbright scholar at the Museo. I was very fortunate in my life. I met 3 truly great teachers. Hughes was one. The other 2 were not social scientists at all. One was the man who taught me piano, jazz piano, Lenny Tristano, who was a kind of legendary teacher. He was legendary because he would never play in public. There are some recordings of him. He was a remarkable jazz pianist. And the third is someone not very well known, a photographer named Philip Perkis, who I took a class from one summer here in San Francisco. And he's totally responsible for my long-standing interest in photography. That was the result of Phil's teaching. And all 3 of these people were wonderful teachers, wonderful in that they didn't tell you to do this or do that. They opened your eyes and your mind.
Teachers.
Oh, I don't know if 1 or 2 or 3 books. There were books that were very influential when I first got into it. The reason I entered sociology was I graduated from undergraduate. I was very young, which is a complicated story, and I was still living with my parents, and I was, I suppose, 18 or 19, and my father would not accept that I should quit school and play the piano full-time on 63rd Street in Chicago. And the easiest thing was to keep going to school, but now I had to pick a subject. What should I study? And I was ready to choose literature because I like to read. But that summer I read the famous book about the black ghetto of Chicago, Black Metropolis. And that book was thrilling. And I got this image of, because I always liked the idea of anthropology, but I didn't like the idea of going, I was like Gilberto. I wanted to do anthropology, but I wanted to sleep in my own bed, eat the kind of food I like to eat. I didn't want to go to, New Guinea and sleep in a tent and eat insects, and whatever my stereotype of anthropology was. And here I saw that you could be an anthropologist, but stay home. You study your own city. I thought, well, yes. And probably the place to do that was sociology. So I enrolled in the sociology department, and as they say, one thing led to another.